All right, Congressman Mike Levin. First, we want to talk about DOGE cuts, how they're impacting San Diego. That's a big question. We all are wondering. Can you tell us what insight you may have on these cuts that are coming from the federal government?
I am worried just like everybody else because of the chaos and confusion and frankly incompetence that I'm witnessing across the board. What we've seen is a first round of cuts that impacted everything from the VA to the people that are responsible for managing our nuclear weapons stockpile. Then we saw a second round of cuts. Of course, we know what's been happening with regard to things like USAID and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and all the rest of it. But what's particularly alarming is a report just yesterday that every agency of the federal government will be expected by March 13th to provide a massive cut, a plan for a massive cut to DOGE, which I think stands for Destruction of Government by Elon. Because that's really what it is. It's not about efficiency as much as it is about just destroying things from the inside. And I think that's their objective. To be honest with you, folks like Russ Vought, who's the head of the Office of Management and Budget, has said as much over the years. I was particularly troubled because a few days ago, there was a Newsweek story, in fact, I have it here, that says, full list of Social Security offices closing after DOGE cuts. And that the same article had the photo of Elon Musk with a chainsaw. And one of the offices mentioned was Carlsbad, California. Now, we have an office in Oceanside, which is right across from the freeway with Carlsbad, but there's technically no office in Carlsbad. So I asked my team, reach out to the Social Security Administration, see what's happening. It's not like you can call, 1-800-ELON to find out what's on their mind. But we got a email back from the Social Security Administration that was frankly just as confusing and actually raised more questions than it answered, neither confirmed nor denied that our office nor any other office would be cut or not. And another reporter yesterday went to the Oceanside office and went to the San Marcos office, and the employees knew nothing. Everything seemed to be operating as normal. And I mentioned to that reporter, give it a day or two, and let's see what happens. And of course, yesterday, the Washington Post reported, and others, in fact, here's one of the articles, Social Security Administration could cut half its workforce. That would include half the staff and potentially half of the offices, which certainly could include our office in our district and throughout San Diego. Why this is so critically important is you have people, of course, tens of millions of people who rely on the Social Security that they receive as a lifeline to be able to survive, to be able to make ends meet. And if they have longer delays or they can't get the services that they need, the benefits that they've earned, this really is the biggest threat to Social Security since Social Security was created decades ago. And I'm going to do everything I can to fight against it. And it's another example of obviously where Elon Musk and President Trump, either they're not on the same page or Trump is not being honest with the American people when he says he won't go after Social Security, just like they're not being honest with the American people when they say they're not going to go after Medicaid, because they're doing that as well.
So as far as you are aware, the office one that doesn't exist in Carlsbad, but the North County offices for Social Security for now are open. They're still functioning. There's still employees there, right?
Correct. I will tell you that it's very uncertain, and all this can change on the whim of Elon Musk. And, the reality is that it's not about efficiency. I think it's been reported broadly that they haven't found nearly what they claimed. The total savings is around $2 billion. And make no mistake, I want to see efficiency. I want to see the federal government tighten its belt across the board. And I don't like bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. But that's not what this is. This is going after people's benefits. It's going after veterans. We know, for example, 2,400 workers at the VA have been let go already. And we know a lot of veterans who rely on things like the Veterans Crisis Line might be impacted because workers at the Veterans Crisis Line have been asked to leave. We also know that you hear about probationary employees who have been fired. The reality is probationary, as it's defined by the federal government, could mean people who were just promoted to be a boss, a supervisor, a manager, who have excellent performance reviews. And a lot of these folks, about 1/3 of them who work for the federal government, are veterans themselves. In fact, yesterday I spoke with a veteran who had been working for the federal government after his military service. He wanted to continue to serve. The federal government's an excellent way to do that. He was working in cybersecurity for the federal government for about a decade. He never had anything but the highest outstanding performance reviews. He was promoted to be a supervisor, and then he was fired. And so we have legislation that I've co-sponsored that says for any veteran, again, 1/3 of the federal workforce, veterans, for any veteran who was fired without cause, hire them back immediately. And we're trying very hard to get that bill to the floor. All we need are 3 Republicans to side with us to get that done.
The veteran you were speaking with, would that be a San Diegan here locally?
He was from Virginia, but there are plenty of veterans from San Diego who are similarly impacted, and I'm going to do everything I can, working with our team, to try to identify them and see if they'll come forward. We know in our district, for example, there are about 15,000 federal employees, so that means there are around 5,000, a third of them, that are veterans themselves. And as I said, having been the chairman and the ranking member on the subcommittee responsible in the House for veteran employment and for job training, all our veterans want usually is to keep serving in whatever capacity they can, and the federal government provides an excellent means of doing that.
At this point, when it comes to the number of people fired, federal workers fired, is there a gauge on how many that would mean for San Diego's area?
Well, I think what you could do is just look at how many federal workers there are across San Diego County. And if Musk had his way, he'd want to hire a huge percentage. I don't have an exact number, but he's talked about as much as half of the Social Security Administration as an example. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people just in San Diego. And of course, across the country, we're talking about between 2 and 3 million federal employees overall. And this is not to say that we should not find waste, fraud, abuse, inefficiency. We should not promote bureaucracy for its own sake. But this isn't about that at all. And it's not about reducing the deficit or the debt either. Republicans just put on the floor a budget proposal that would increase the national debt by $4 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars over a decade. They cannot claim to be for government efficiency and for fiscal responsibility, and at the same time have that bloated budget that they voted on with a bare majority, party line majority yesterday, to have $4 trillion in debt to pay for tax cuts for billionaires like Musk. They cannot claim to be fiscally responsible and do that.
I know we want to get into that major budget plan here in a moment, but I know we want to talk about the, you mentioned Social Security benefits could be impacted. What about things like CalFresh, where so many families rely on? Do you think that will also be cut?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the sad reality of the budget proposal that we saw, a couple things are very clear. There are between $880 billion and $1.5 trillion in cuts to Medicaid. And what that will mean for San Diegans and people all across the United States is if you have seniors who are on Medi-Cal, maybe living in a nursing home, or you have kids and families who rely on Medi-Cal for their health insurance, a lot of those people are not going to be able to have health insurance. They may not have the place to live. This is about potential shutdowns and reduction in services and longer wait times for community clinics, potential shutdown of skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, maybe hospitals as well. Of course, the state of California is running a budget deficit as well. And there are two things. One is what's called FMAP, the percentage that the federal government matches for every Medi-Cal dollar that California puts in. They want to cut that dramatically. And second is the Republicans want to put a cap per person on the amount the federal government can spend on Medicaid and Medi-Cal related reimbursement, and that will harm people immeasurably as well. On nutrition aid, we know that they want to go after SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, and that include in California, that's CalFresh, and that includes a lot of kids. And we know that a lot of kids rely on free and reduced lunch, rely on what CalFresh provides, and they're going to be hurt. And I just don't understand the cruelty in saying that you want tax cuts where disproportionate benefit goes to the very wealthiest and those most vulnerable in our society, like seniors who might be kicked out on the street or children who might be forced to go hungry, are going to have to pay the bill. For what? So that Elon Musk can have a bigger tax cut. It's reprehensible. And they're driving an even bigger hole in the debt while they're at it.
Now, are you aware of any instances of federal fraud and waste that have been discovered here in San Diego?
No.
Okay, not at all. I know we've heard about national parks. And
if you go on Elon's website, maybe you'll see different. But I went on there and all I saw were clerical errors. I saw about $2 billion, and that's independent analysis of that DOGE data, about $2 billion in actual cuts, which is a far cry from what they talked about. I also wonder, incidentally, I wonder what Elon is actually doing here. Is this about government efficiency, or is it really about AI replacing government workers? When Elon wrote the email to the 2 million federal employees recently to justify why they were worth keeping as federal workers, their replies were all fed into Elon's AI model. And I wonder, is Elon using all the data that DOGE is collecting across the federal agencies to also train that AI model that he wants to turn into the most powerful AI company in the world in order to replace those very federal workers? Unfortunately, there's no oversight of what he's doing. There's no Senate-confirmed person there. There's no guardrails at all. There's no one watching the store of what this DOGE effort is all about, other than, as I said, it is destruction of government by Elon, pure and simple.
We've heard a lot about national parks and the cuts to staff among there. I know here in California, we love our natural resources. Tell us about that. What have you heard happening here in Southern California? How does this impact our parks and, the environment as we know it here?
Well, our national parks are our greatest national treasures. And for 6 years, I was on the House Natural Resources Committee and advocating for all of our wonderful national parks. I visited many of them myself. I'm now an appropriator on the Appropriations Committee with oversight of energy and water matters, and obviously very, very concerned. I saw the folks up in Yosemite that hung the American flag upside down as a symbol of distress that the National Park Service was under attack from Elon Musk. And my hope is that our wonderful bipartisan support that we've had for our national parks does not go away because my Republican colleagues are scared of Donald Trump and scared of Elon Musk. It is worth mentioning that Elon Musk contributed almost $300 million to Republican campaigns this past cycle. Many of those dollars went directly to my Republican colleagues. And what I see now, unfortunately, is cowardice. I see cowardice and I see efforts to misrepresent what's happening. They're not standing up for their Article 1, and all of us have Article 1 responsibility under the Constitution. We have the power of the purse. It is our responsibility to stand up for federal spending, to appropriate the funds, to authorize the programs. That is not the responsibility of the president. It is not the responsibility of the executive branch. It was not the responsibility of Joe Biden or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, or certainly not Donald Trump either. And to my Republican friends, there will come a day where you have a Democratic president in the White House. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you want that Democratic president with whom you don't share values, with whom you don't share policy priorities? Do you want them to have the same unchecked authority that you're giving Donald Trump right now? And if the answer is no, you want checks and balances, you want oversight, you want independence and accountability as the founders intended, then watch what you're doing today, because it's going to have a lasting impact for generations to come.
And Congressman, the House's budget resolution, let's talk about that. It calls for $880 billion in cuts to federal funding, Republicans say they'll be able to find enough chances of fraud, waste, inefficiency to make those cuts without capping coverage for people on Medicaid. What's your response to that?
Two things. One is their own budget documents. Their budget committee, Chairman Jody Arrington, very clearly lays out that they want to make massive cuts to Medicaid. They want to go after both the federal match for the state funding, and they want to put a per person cap on the amount of federal funds that can go to Medicaid. So it is a joke. They know it's a joke. I just told one of my Republican colleagues behind closed doors that it's a joke, that they're saying that they're not going after Medicaid, because they are. The question is how much. The $880 billion is a floor. The reality is it could be as much as $1.5 trillion going after Medicaid. And they also, as we know, want to put other onerous restrictions and requirements on the funding that, history demonstrates do not do much good at all, other than cutting people off programs who really need them. So that's number one. Number two is that Musk has been engaged in this supposed effort to cut waste, fraud, and abuse for the last 5 weeks, and they found $2 billion. $2 billion. Republicans saying they're going to find $880 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. We know that that's just false. And I hope that every American is just able to look at this with eyes wide open. This is not what they bargained for with Donald Trump. When they voted for Donald Trump, they wanted lower prices. They wanted immigration solutions. And instead, what we're seeing is an extreme agenda, gutting things like Medicaid, going after Social Security, and ultimately doing nothing on prices, other than threatening tariffs on Canada and Mexico that actually might make prices even worse. So people are just not getting what they're bargaining for. And I've heard that from lots of Republicans, that they're disappointed.
I'm curious how many people in your district could lose Medicaid coverage if that happens.
We have 132,000 or so who are on Medi-Cal in our district. And to know the exact number who would lose coverage completely, the number who would have significant reductions in their coverage, I don't know the exact number because we don't know the exact extent of what these cuts will be. But I can tell you with confidence it will be tens of thousands of people, and it'll be the biggest attack on Medicaid since the creation of Medicaid back in the 60s.
It does look like the House and Senate, not in agreement with the big budget plan, as you mentioned earlier, could move to continuing resolution. What are the major holdups, first of all, in this plan? Why do you think it may not pass?
Well, we don't know what their plan is. So you have Republicans in charge of the White House, Republicans in charge of the Senate, Republicans in charge of the House. And as of right now, they're not on the same page. And I don't want to negotiate against myself or speak in hypotheticals because we don't know exactly what they're going to come up with. But they right now are in charge of the three levers of government or the executive and the legislative. They also have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. That's another matter. And it's really incumbent on them to figure this mess out. And it seems to be they don't want to do it with Democratic support because they're not having a good faith discussion with us. I wish they would. It takes two to tango. We want to have a good faith discussion around spending, around taxes, around the long-term debt and deficit. And none of that has happened. None of that has happened. And it's a huge missed opportunity because when Trump was president the first time, we were able to work with his administration. I was able to get 16 bills signed into law by President Trump. And I was hoping that they might consider this an opportunity to work with those of us on our side as well on common sense solutions to the challenges everyday Americans are facing. But in the last 5 weeks, there's been none of that. There's been empowering Elon Musk, who wasn't elected to anything, and he's been given far too much power. And now there are cuts that they're proposing to Medicaid. And now we're talking about Social Security on the chopping block for the offices and the workers in Social Security offices nationwide. Veterans are going to be worse off because of the 2,400 cuts and counting at the VA. And we know that every agency, in addition to the cuts that they've already had to make, are being asked by Musk for a bigger plan for more cuts by March 13. What happens the day after? March 14 is when the government could shut down.
Are we on the verge of a government shutdown, do you think? Are the signs headed that way?
Well, I have learned my lesson to not predict the future around here. So I am not going to predict the future other than to tell you I'm going to do everything that I can, as I have throughout my 7 years in Congress, to be reasonable and to try to listen and to try to make a good judgment, a good decision based on the best outcome for our community and for our country.
Okay. Congressman, also real quick, as far as any San Diegans, if you could touch on, have you talked to locals that have lost their jobs here, that have been part of these cuts that you've heard from personally by chance, that you can share maybe their stories?
We have spoken with scores of people locally that have lost their funding or have lost the opportunity. Medical research immediately comes to mind, the cuts to the NIH and the NSF, the potential to freeze those funds. We know now that layoffs, throughout the county have occurred at the VA and at other offices, including from veterans, themselves, a lot of our federal workforce, about 1/3 of our federal workforce. And my hope is that in the days and weeks to come, that they'll be able to personally share their stories. I know that it takes a lot of courage to do that, but that's really my hope. And our State of the Union guest is actually a gentleman who's been working on cancer research for a number of years. He's a cancer survivor himself, and he's deeply concerned that the NIH cuts at UC San Diego and all of our institutions are going to decimate our local economy, but also make it harder to find cures for cancer and Alzheimer's, ALS, diabetes, all the other things that are being worked at UCSD and across San Diego. So we knew that there would be an attempt to make government more efficient, but we had no idea that it would be so broad and frankly done in such a chaotic, incompetent, and potentially a very corrupt way, because again, we don't know what Musk and his team are doing with this data. And if in fact they are using it to train their own artificial intelligence, then that creates all sorts of legal problems and conflicts of interest.
Okay, Congressman, thank you very much for your time.
One thing I forgot to mention is very important on the Social Security piece. You should know that a virtually unknown mid-level longtime worker at the Social Security Administration named Leland Dudek was being investigated in January for potentially misusing data acquired through his job and sharing it with DOGE. He was being investigated. He was put on administrative leave in January for potential violations of policy, but also of law. And that same person, Leland Dudek, was then named a month later by President Trump as the acting director of Social Security. And he's now in charge, and he's the one working with DOGE formally and officially. And if you don't think they're going after Social Security, then you're not looking at the situation rationally or clearly. It's happening right before our eyes. We have to be careful that across the federal government, that this isn't just a heist for Elon Musk at the expense of seniors and families and children.
All right. Thank you, sir. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Right. I had to tell you about Leland Dudek because you can't make this stuff up.
Okay.
Okay.
Appreciate that. Have a great day. Thank you.
You too.